right. Well, we appreciate you joining us this afternoon for our NAL ED webinar on sustainability. We will kick it off as usual with our disclaimer. This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number ED-ESE 15A 0015/0006 with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education if any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. Now that everyone is sufficiently disclaimed, so today we're going to be talking about sustainability, very timely as we head into kind of the last 6 months for the majority of our grantees and into that last year for Albuquerque. So as we think about today, we're going to talk about what do we mean by program sustainability? What does that include? What does that look like? Who should be involved on our sustainability planning team and why is that important? And then we'll really get into the meat of the matter with what do you need to sustain in order to keep your program up and going and how can you do that? And then we'll finish up with some discussion around how to do some action planning. If you have any questions as we go along, feel free to pop those in the chat box and we'll get to them throughout the time as well as at the end of the presentation too. So as we think about program sustainability, a lot of times what immediately comes to mind is to maintain or endure. We want to be able to maintain our program as it is now. Or we think about it specifically as what happens after grant funding. So whatever that might look like, that's our sustainability, is what's happening after that funding ends. And what I really want to think about it as today, though, is the ability to maintain your programming and its benefits over time. So as we think about not just your program, but also the benefits that it provides to students and families in your community, how can we maintain that over time? All right. Now, often when you think about sustaining a grant, you immediately think about that full grant award. And as you can see from the chart and as you know from your grant proposals, that can seem like quite a leap to come up with that much money. That's a lot to try to maintain. So it might seem a little overwhelming. The idea of pulling $1 million or more out of a magical hat might seem a little bit impossible, or even your annual budgets, which tend to range anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000 a year. So that's why we really want to dig a little bit deeper into sustainability, what that means, and what it could look like for you that's going to be a little bit more achievable and manageable as we break it down. So sustainability can and will look different for each of you. It's because each of your programs are different. It might be that you want to maintain your program activities just as you have them now, or you may have a plan to continue to grow your program, such as adding the next applicable grade level each year. I know many of you each year are wanting to grow up a grade level. Or it might be a more global goal of continuing to help students grow in their language learning. And you may address that through a different program model than you're currently using. You might also want to make sure that the partnerships that you fostered through this grant continue well beyond your grant funding. So that might be a focus for your sustainability. Or your sustainability might look like specific policies that you were able to put in place, such as all Native students receiving an opportunity to engage in language learning, and you want that to remain intact. Often it's going to be a mixture of all of these sustainability goals and outcomes. So we're going to walk through exactly how to determine what your sustainability can and should look like. So to kick us off, we have a little quiz, little poll, so that'll pop up on the screen for you to be able to vote. And we're going to talk about where do you feel like you are with your sustainability planning? And do you feel like I have a solid plan, we're making solid progress towards sustainability, not worried about it? Maybe you've made substantial progress, but you don't necessarily have a full plan in place. Or possibly you've begun to put a sustainability plan in place, but you feel like there needs to be more work done in that area. You've begun initial conversations, or maybe you haven't started at all. Any of these levels are completely fine. It's an anonymous poll, so you don't have to worry about answering, but just for you to really think about where do you feel like your program is right now? And if you think that you might be in between levels or you're not exactly sure, you can pick the level that you just think might be closest. All right, so it looks like we have a bit of a mixture. Some folks, we have one who feels like they've got a plan in place. They're going to sustain, they're not worried about it. And then others who've just begun that planning or have started some definite progress, but need to do some additional work. All right. So you should be able to see the results on your screen. You can kind of see where everybody else lies. Perfect. So as I said before, there's not really a right or wrong place to be with your sustainability planning right now, but that's why we want to look at it before it gets to the very end of the year. Because if we do wait till the very end of the grant cycle, you don't have much time to plan. So before we go too far into thinking about the whole package of sustainability, we want to think about who's going to help you. So like with many project components that we've talked about, it can be easy to dive into this planning all by yourself and think that you've got to figure out how to sustain this program all alone. But ideally, you really want a team. A strong sustainability planning team can help you devise and implement the best sustainability plan possible. As you determine who to include on your sustainability planning team, remember to think about both your internal and your external stakeholders. If you currently have an advisory or program planning committee, that could be a great place to start because it's already folks who are highly engaged and have a really good working knowledge of your program. Then think through what administrative members of your organization would be vital to include. So do you really need to include the principal? Is this something that you need someone from maybe executive leadership and the school district involved with? Do you need someone from maybe tribal council? Who are those administrative members that would be really integral to making this successful? Often you're going to need their input and decision-making abilities to help ensure the success of your plan. Even if they're not the ones who might be doing the legwork, they may be the ones who are helping you actually push this toward success. And then finally, think about the staff members who are integral to the successful implementation of your program. These staff members can be vital to your sustainability planning, and we'll touch a little bit more later about how they can really help you figure out what you need to sustain. Then as we look over at the other side to your external stakeholders, begin by including your current community partners as well as any potential community partners that you'd like to bring into your program. So maybe there are some partners that you think would be really beneficial that you haven't partnered with yet, but you determine would be helpful in your sustaining. So next, start thinking about individuals who have a great knowledge of your program, community, and/or funding. Both are skill areas that are going to come in handy with your sustainability planning. So they may know your community really well, they may know funding really well. In a magical world, they may know both really well. And then finally, think about individuals with influence in your community. We'll talk a little bit more later about community support and program champions, but know that these individuals with influence are really key to your sustainability success as well. And also, don't overlook your program families as you recruit planning team members. You may find that they can really fill a lot of roles on your team as well. Now, as we think about the roles or skills that you need on your sustainability team, and not just the specific categories of people, let's start thinking about who you might want to include. So let's check out our program planning team here and some of the roles that they're going to be filling. So you'll see our friend in purple, her role within the larger organization gives her insight into how this program fits within the organization and strategic plan. She can also provide support as you begin advocating for and implementing the plan. And think about, do you have people who could fill that type of role? Or over in green, I help launch this program and can provide a historical perspective of the program. So that's going to be more of like your instructional staff or some of your maybe program coordinator level folks. And then finally, our gentleman in brown here. I implement the program day to day and can provide insight into what's feasible. That would definitely be your teachers, letting you know what's necessary. So as you think about that, I want to think about, who do you think would be someone really great to get on your sustainability planning team? And if you can put that over in the chat box. If you haven't used the chat box before, if you go to the top of your screen, it's a little bit different because we're in share screen. And if I don't click, you should see that you're sharing or you're viewing my screen, and then there's a little drop-down menu beside that, and you should have an option for chat right in that menu. And that way you can get over into the chat box and share. It can be a specific entity, it can be a specific person, but let us know, who are those folks that you think you should add to your team. Maybe it's a specific role, and who can help you with this work. Now I'm going to go over, I'm going to stop share so we can easily get to the chat box. If we're not in share screen, so if we're in share screen, the chat box is up in the top menu. If we're not in share screen, then you can actually look down at the bottom, and there's a little bubble. It looks like a little talk bubble that says chat. And if you click on that, it brings up your chat box on the far right side of your screen. And that's where you can go ahead and type, who do you think would be a great person to have on your sustainability team? I'll put a question over there for you as well. All right, as y'all are sharing, we'll come back and get some of those answers, but I'm gonna keep us going along. And I noticed that Susan already answered that outside of school district personnel, that she thinks it'd be really helpful to have tribal language advocates from the 11 tribes. And I think that would be super helpful. Those are those folks that would be kind of external individuals, but they're going to bring a lot of influence and information to your sustainability team. Thanks for sharing. So you can keep popping those over as we start thinking about the what and the how of sustainability planning. And this is really how we're going to break it down for the bulk of our conversation. Once you have a strong team to help you, we really want to get to the nitty-gritty of sustainability planning. What are you going to sustain, and how are you going to do that? And while those may seem pretty straightforward, there are actually a lot of things to consider within each one. So let's think about a few helpful documents that may be useful as you actually jump into this. First, make sure that your mission and your vision statements are prominently displayed during any planning sessions that you have with your sustainability planning team, and that all your team members fully understand them. You may feel like everybody knows them already, but particularly if you're bringing in external folks or people maybe within your organization that aren't as familiar with your grant, they may not really know what those are. And your mission and vision really should be guiding all of your funding decisions and all of your sustainability planning. Next, think about your current program budget. Include information on any funding sources beyond your NAL grant. This will be extremely important as you work through your plan. This also includes any MOUs or contracts that you have with partners, because you're going to want to know exactly what goods and services are included in those and what, if any, monetary implications are included. So as you look at those partnerships, I know many of them sometimes include monies that you may be receiving from a partner, or it may be more of a contract where you're paying monies to a partner. All right. And then as we continue, think about also your strategic planning documents. So any strategic planning documents that you have that detail your short and long-term program goals, whether that be your project planner, maybe you have an internal strategic planning document. This is really going to help you as you start thinking about what's going to be sustained and when. Also, if you have a program logic model, this would be a great thing to bring out and have available. And then finally, most of you have used a program evaluator. The evaluation reports that they prepare are going to be really important to this conversation, as well as you look at the evidence that each of your program activities is meeting goals and objectives, what the benefits are of those different components, the challenges, and general program support. So If your program evaluator is also available, they can make a great part of your sustainability planning team. All right. So as we think about your key program elements, so each of the components of your program that you feel are key, we want to start thinking about, in the mind of sustainability, what parts of your program do you need to sustain? And then what parts of your program do you want to sustain? Now, I know those questions really sound similar, but they're getting at two distinctly different things. Things you need to sustain are the program activities and components that are necessary for you to continue meeting your goals or providing benefits. Okay? So when we think about, are you still going to be able to provide the same benefits? That's when you're going to think about those needs. Now, items that you want to sustain might still bring benefit, but they're not going to be required in order to continue providing the benefit to the families. It might be an add-on, a bonus add, something that brings additional benefit, but it's not something that you have to have in order to sustain your program. All right, let's look at an example. So for our sample program, and this is a very bare bones version of how you do this brainstorm, but for our sample program, we've decided we have to sustain our kindergarten teacher's salary plus fringe benefits. So our full salary package. If we don't have a teacher, we can't provide instruction, we have to have that to sustain. And we've decided that we must purchase one consumable language workbook per student per year. So this was another program component that we've decided, in order to continue providing the level of service and benefit to our students, we have to have this. Now, when we look at what we would like to sustain, if we're able to, we've been subscribing to a language learning app for each student. So we'd like to continue doing that. However, we can sustain our program without it. So it's a want versus a need. And then we really feel like the annual professional learning conference that we've been traveling to has been really beneficial to the teachers. So we'd like to continue doing registration and travel expenses for that. It's a want, though. We could keep doing our program without it. Okay? So you can kind of see how we're going to start breaking down our program by those things we really have to have in order to sustain our needs versus what we'd really like to continue having if available, our wants. Now, as you think about that, there's some important considerations, because sometimes we go straight to those instructional costs and we may leave out a few things. So it's definitely important, as you're looking at all this, to have out your program budget and those strategic planning documents. That's going to be really helpful as you start breaking it down into actual components. So let's think about some of these considerations. When we think about personnel, one thing that often gets overlooked are those fringe benefit costs. That can be a significant chunk of your budget when you start talking about insurance and the various benefit packages that your organizations offer. So make sure you've included for that, as well as for likely salary increases. While many organizations don't necessarily do yearly, they may do every other year, every 3 years, and you want to be prepared for the fact that most likely salaries will increase. Then when we think about supplies and materials, consumable supplies can be a significant ongoing expense, but also you may need additional computers, printers. If your plan includes adding a grade level each year, you may need additional supplies and materials for those new classrooms each year. Then as we think about evaluation, do you plan to continue to engage the services of an evaluator beyond the life of your grant? Some of you have been having an evaluator as part of the grant, some of you have not. But think about, is that something that you want to continue as you go into those out years beyond grant funding? Could you possibly scale them back so that they're doing a little bit less, therefore a little more affordable? What are those options? Think about professional development. Okay, often this seems to be one of the first areas that get cut, but you have to remember that your staff need to be adequately prepared and supported in their work, and keeping your staff developed is a great way to retain staff. Now, as we move into curriculum and assessment development, this is something that every single one of you has been engaged in. So you may have completed your planned curriculum development, but are you going to need additional grade levels? Do you need to update some of the existing materials or those expenses that you need to account for? Also, some of you have created some consumable materials like workbooks or little student books. That's something that you'll need to continue purchasing. That would be a significant expense to go ahead and include in those sustainability plans. And then things like with your assessment. While you may have finished developing the assessment, you might need to continue purchasing testing materials. You might need to continue paying external testers to come in. So there are definitely some other expenses that can come in there. And then many of you have provided some really amazing cultural activities, field trips, different activities like that that are additional expenses. So do you plan to continue this? How integral is this to your program? Is it a need or is it a want? Maybe it's a need to do a scaled down version and a want to keep it at the continued version. And then as we think about our partners and contracts that we may have with other providers, which of those are in kind? Do they plan to continue being in kind beyond the 3-year grant cycle? Those that you do have some level of payment to them, will you need to continue paying at that level? Is it something that you can maybe negotiate a reduced cost? And then as we think about infrastructure, almost all of you are taking indirect costs, which goes toward a number of infrastructure expenses. So once grant funding ends, will you be responsible for any of those expenses beyond that? So things like space fees, utility fees, transportation, technology, insurance. Those are good things to check on now so you're not surprised by them later. And then finally, as you think about all of these considerations, really think about startup versus ongoing expense. So a lot of your startup expenses were covered through the grant. However, while this should lower your overall budget needed for those years after grant funding, if you're planning on expanding your program, whether that's adding additional grade levels, expanding the capacity of your program, whatever the instance may be, you may have additional startup costs. If you're opening new classrooms, if you're building out the program, there may be some of those additional startup costs. But it's important to think through those. So I just gave you a million things to think about. So we're going to get some of those thoughts out. Okay, so we're going to do a quick brainstorm. And this is going to be your first chance to do one of the things that folks say they really enjoy, which is to write on the webinar screen. So if you have not written on the screen before, it's pretty easy. You're going to go right to the top of the screen. You're going to see where it says you're viewing my screen. And then out to the side, there's that drop-down menu. One of your options will say annotate. When you hit annotate, it brings up a whole nother toolbar. And on that toolbar, you'll see you have lots of different options. The easiest way is to just hit text. Once you do that, click on the screen and write on the screen. Do keep in mind that if you're thinking it's not working, we just can't see it until you click out of it. So now you can see that I wrote on the screen. So I want you to just brainstorm. What are a couple of things that you feel you need to sustain that are integral to your program? And what are a couple of things that you want to sustain? You'd love to keep going if funding were available, but not required for success in the program. So I'm going to give you a little time to work on that. Oh. And like I said, you can put that right up on the screen. If you're having difficulty figuring out how to write on the screen, you can also unmute and happy to help, or you can even pop them into the chat box and I'll transfer them over for you. And I know this first one's overlapping just a hair. I'm going to move it down, don't worry. Remember to also include what are those things that you know are not necessarily a have to have, they're not a need, but you'd really like to be able to continue them. Those are important as well. All right, and you'll see the first folks to start sharing talked about it's integral to their program to continue having a native language coordinator and language assistant, and having funds to travel to the villages to build relationships with the students. So I happen to know this is the Yukon program, and because Susan provides a lot of her instruction virtually, that's definitely a cost savings as far as having to have teachers who are out in the villages at all times, but that it's important that she is able to routinely go out each semester to those villages. And then the workbooks that they've developed. So yeah, those are great needs. And then another program has said it's necessary that they continue to have a project manager, someone who can really lead this work. Now, over on the want side, do we have anything? And we're a small group, so if you want to unmute and just share out loud, you're welcome to. But are there any things that you would consider a want? Or we may be really focused on our needs today.
I would say supplies and materials.
Okay. Yeah, so Charlene's saying, a lot of the supplies and materials that they use now, you'd really want to continue having to be able to provide the activities and different things that you do with the students now, but if you had to, you could do without them. Looks like somebody was typing away as we were working. Professional development training, headphones, so that the students are able to engage with those online resources without upsetting others, and then hands-on materials, so like snacks for the food unit. Yeah, so, and you'll see a lot of those tend to be very similar to what Charlene was talking about, some supplies and materials that really increase the quality of our activities and of our program, but if we had to do without them, we can make it work.
And probably the field trips. What was it? It said something with field trips and some activities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we can all agree the field trips have added a lot to many of your programs and some of the opportunities that you've been able to bring to the students. But yeah, as we look at sustainability and start kind of getting things down to bare bones, wants versus needs, those are things that we might put in the want, that we'd love to continue doing it if funding's available, but we wouldn't have to have it in order to continue providing language programming for our students. Great. Oh, and then I'm going to move this one so I can share it with everyone. Here we go. All right, so everyone can see that now. Contracts to keep the digital storybook an ongoing activity. Definitely, because that is an ongoing expense, but something, again, that would fit under that want. And working with other tribes who speak the same language and being able to assist one another to complete resources to assist teachers and students in the classroom and building resources for the entire community. So yeah, so as you look at ways that you want to branch out your project, that they don't fit quite under the need, but they're definitely a want and a great thing to work toward it as part of your sustainability. And then the other thing to think about with sustainability as we think about these wants versus needs is to also think about sustaining our staffing. And someone put under need their project manager, and that was someone that that's a need. They have to continue. But often as grants end or just as life occurs, we sometimes have some staffing changes. So think about, for those project managers, project directors, project coordinators, if they were not there and someone else was taking over, Has a roadmap really been laid out? So do they know how to continue on with things? Do they know what are the wants and what are the needs? Do they know about the partners? Do they know about the professional development plan? Do they know about the curriculum and assessment? So how well laid out are those items? That's going to be a need as well, is making sure that as part of your sustainability, you also have that succession planning in place. So just 2 additional thoughts to add in there. Now I'm going to go ahead and clear these. They'll still be in the recording so that you can get to them. This way they won't be on our next slide. Yeah, and someone just got in an answer that, yeah, you need to have someone who can teach the 2 languages. So particularly, all of our grantees really have to always be looking at who can teach the language, but particularly if you're working with multiple languages, finding individuals who can teach both of them is even more important. All right. Let me go to the next slide. There we go. Let's stop for a minute. All right. So now that you've really thought about some of those things that are absolute needs for your program versus wants for your program, we want to take it a little bit further and start thinking about that a little more long term. So sometimes when we start thinking about sustainability, particularly when it's getting close to the end of a grant, we can get hyper focused on what do we have to do to just keep going the next school year. And it's not that we don't want to look at what we need to do to keep going for the next school year, but it's really important to have a little bit longer term planning in place, okay? So I know none of you want to just sustain for 1 year. So at minimum, I would suggest looking at 3 years. And often people will look at about 3 to 5 years out. So that means that when you start looking at your needs and wants now, we want to forecast out what those will be for the next 3 years. Okay? So think about if you're a program who wants to grow your program, how do those needs and wants grow across the next 3 years? Are there want items that over time may move over into need items? Overall, how will those needs increase, or do you think that they'll remain pretty much the same over the next 3 years? So those are important kind of things to start thinking about now as you forecast out for your long-term planning. So let's look back at an example. So we had our example before that we wanted our kindergarten teacher salary and fringe benefits and our language workbook. Those were our 2 absolute needs. But as we thought about it, our plan has always been to add a grade level each year. So in order to do that, then in year 2, I'm going to need to find funding to be able to fund a kindergarten and a first grade teacher, still continue my language workbooks, but of course for more students. And at that point, I think it's a need that we go ahead and bring back some professional learning. So maybe we're not going to go to that conference every year, but I feel like we have to go at least every other year and get some professional training. So, and then in my year 3, I've got to find a kindergarten, first and second grade teacher. So that's how I've kind of plotted out my next 3 years. And my wants have changed too. So originally my wants were that professional learning conference and the language learning app. In year 2, I said, no, professional learning needs to be happening at least every other year in regards to language specific learning. But then it's back into a want for year 3. So I've come up with a way that I think I can kind of balance it. So those are the things to really think about and sit down with your sustainability planning team and really brainstorm out. What is that program going to look like as it goes out over the next 3 to 5 years? All right, now we're going to take it a little further. So now that you've begun thinking about what specific program activities and components you want and need to sustain and what that looks like over time, we also have to think about what is the actual price tag of this. How much is that actually going to cost? Because bottom line, that's the amount of money that we've got to come up with. That's what your budget is going to be at minimum. So let's look at a little example of, again, a basic brainstorm of this information. So maybe I know that my kindergarten teacher salary plus fringe is going to be $57,000 a year next year. My workbooks run me $10 a workbook, and my kindergarten class typically has about 35 students, so that's going to run me about $350. So I know that for the things I need to sustain, I'm going to need at least $57,350. Now, when I start adding in my wants, my language app runs $250 a student. And again, I have typically about 35 students, so that's about $87.50. And then that conference is usually $500. Travel is usually about $1,000 a person. And we typically send 2 staff, our project coordinator and the teacher. So that's going to run me another $3,000. So then I have an idea of how much I need to come up with for the things I need versus the things I want. So it starts giving you a target monetarily. But remember, we want to also look at this long term. So we want to see how is this price tag going to change over those 3 years so that you can really be doing that future planning that's so important. So while year 1, my needs are only $57,350, you'll see in year 2, my staff really increases because I know that my school district, they do yearly raises. So between that and a possible increase in my fringe benefits, it's going to be about $58,500 per staff member. So I went from needing $57,000 for staff to $117,000 for staff. My workbook expense is going to go up because now I'm going to have 70 students instead of 35. And in year 2, I plan on sending everyone to the professional learning conference. So that's 3 staff at $4,500. So you can see my year 2 budget really hiked up from year 1. And that's going to be really important to know as I'm trying to figure out how to sustain over the next few years. Year 3, we start thinking about, okay, now I have 3 teachers. So now it's gone up to $180,000. This is why it's really important to go ahead and look at that long-term planning, because if I was only planning in my mind to come up with $57,350 every year, then I wouldn't be able to expand out my program per my plan. And then my wants, you can see the cost change as well, because things like the conference expense increases as our staffing increases, the subscription to the language learning app will go up as we have more students. So all of these things change the costs that you will need to budget for. All right, so we've talked a good bit about the what. So you have kind of in your head now, hopefully, a few things that you know are definite needs versus wants in your own program. So at this point, we're now going to move over to the how, which is what everyone always wants to know. Great, if I need $100,000 next year, how do I get that? The first thing that I would suggest that you do when you're thinking about that is think about your current funding structure. So where do you currently receive money for your program? And remember to think about every funding source, including those that are in kind. In-kind resources are invaluable. So make sure that when you're filling this out and you're brainstorming with your sustainability planning team, that you think about literally every funding source. This is another good place to go ahead and document that as well, because as we think about that succession planning, and if there were other folks in leadership roles over your program, this would be really helpful to them to be able to see where all your funding is coming from. So let's look at an example. Many programs, this is what their chart looks like. They have the NAL grant. It provides them with a certain amount of money. It ends the end of September 2020. And there's that potential to reapply when that becomes available. And then the school district does provide some in-kind support, approximately, for this example, $75,000 that covers facility usage, utilities, transportation, things like that. And that's an ongoing commitment that they've made. So that's what many folks' current funding resources looks like. We also have some that have a little bit more diversified funding resources. So you'll see this particular grantee, they have the same school district in-kind support and they have the grant, but they also have some support from their tribe. So they received $25,000. Now, the restrictions is a really important thing to make sure and denote when you're going through your funding resources. This money can only be used for language preservation activities for K through 12 youth. It's also renewed in July of each year, so it's an annual funding, and it's always subject to tribal council approval. So while it's a good funding source, it does have some restrictions, and it does always have that possibility to not be reapproved. And then you'll see they also received some money from the XYZ Foundation, $15,000, but again, for a specific thing. It's to provide cultural activities for K through 6 students. So if you have a high school program, those monies couldn't help to sustain that. It's for K through 6 and for cultural activities. And for this particular one, it's a 2-year grant. It expires not this summer, but the following summer. But for this, much like the NAL grant, there is that potential to reapply. So in order to really start planning how you're going to sustain, it's important to see where you are right now. All right, so as we go through, let's think about the funding resources that you've been able to utilize beyond your NAL funds. So have you been able to utilize any foundation funds or school district funds? Do you have partners that help offset the cost of some of your activities, whether that's in kind or monetarily? So this is another opportunity for you to be able to write on the screen. Again, if you're having any trouble annotating on the screen, you're welcome to unmute or put it in the chat box, and I can get it transferred over to the screen for you. And you don't have to put, if you're not comfortable putting the actual organization name, that's fine. You can always put just a generic category, like a local nonprofit or local foundation. But what are those funding resources that you've been able to leverage alongside your NAL funds? I know that many of you have been able to partner with other organizations, and that has been very helpful as far as funding, and are likely things that you can continue after grant funding. And if anybody wants to just unmute and share, you're welcome to just holler out funding resources that you've used. JOM funds through partners, absolutely, and tribal monies. Don't worry, I'm going to scooch those over. There you go. Yeah, so the JOM funds, which I know many of you have been able to at least somewhat leverage. Also your tribal dollars. Let's see, to support language activities, the Regional Educational Foundation helped develop a free language app. The Regional Nonprofit Tribal Consortium helps provide remote culture camps. And then local tribes provide after-school funding. So a number of local resources that have been able to partner alongside the grant to provide activities for your students. Wonderful. All right. As we look at these, who put up the JOM funds? Anybody? Is there anyone, whether it's the person who put up JOM funds or anyone else, that would like to explain to those who are not as familiar what those are and how you've been able to partner with them? All right. Oh, how do I unmute? So if you look at the bottom left of your screen, actually, I will stop sharing so you can even see it a little easier. If you go to the bottom left of your screen, there's a little microphone.
Oh, there it is.
There it is.
Okay. This is Susan with Yukon Koyukuk School District. Yeah, once you stop share, then that option shows up. So we're in Alaska, and our Doyon Foundation, they're the nonprofit organization that gets funding from our profit corporation. Anyway, so we develop language apps in both Danaga and Benti, the two languages within our school district. And so we've been using that in our schools and for grades 4 on up, and the students have really been enjoying that. We've been doing that after school. And then the Tana Chiefs Conference, the regional nonprofit organization, they've been hosting culture camps either in the summer or in the fall time. And so they provide the majority of the funding, and then they also provide like a communications person to come along and record the whole thing. And then our school district, part of that is we do the language lesson part along with the tribe. And then our local tribes, for example, my home village, they have an after-school program. So the tribe provides after-school funding. They provide a staff member, and they'll do language lessons using what we have in the school and also what's from the Doyon Languages app. And that will be multi-generational. We had a couple of them, and so far we decided that we'll have some that are together and we'll have some that's just for the adults, because they know less language than their kids or grandkids.
Yeah, and the kids like to teach them, but I think sometimes, yes, the adults like to learn together as adults.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. Well, and I think our JOM friend may be feeling shy or may be unable to mute and share out. So just for anybody who's not as familiar with those are the Johnson O'Malley Fund. And those monies are specifically for American Indian and Alaska Native students. And you'll want to figure out, if you have not talked to the person within your organization or district or community who has those funds, you'd want to chat with them, because it can be used for programs such as culture, language, academics, and dropout prevention. I think all of your various programs, you can see how that would then fit right alongside. So that's definitely a funding source that you would want to chat with the person who heads that up. All right. We're going to jump back in. All right. So once you've figured out the price tag of the things that you want and the things that you need, and you've looked at what funding you have available, then it starts to be a little bit clear where you have those gaps. Okay. So what I mean by that is that as you think about all those things that you're wanting and the funding that you'll have after the grant, there's definitely going to be some discrepancy there. So we want to look at what that's going to be. So let's go over to this example. So in this example, we're looking at where the gaps would be if you did not have NAL funding. Now, I know many of you are looking at reapplying for NAL funding. And I would encourage you to really look at this in two ways. Look at it as what would be the gaps if you did have NAL funding, and what would be the gaps if you didn't have NAL funding. Because one important thing to remember as you think about reapplying for another cycle of NAL funding is that that would be for a new project. So that might be building on to your existing project, but it wouldn't be to fund the exact projects and activities that are happening in your current grant. And we'll definitely chat about that more, and we can talk about it more today if you have questions even today, but we're definitely going to get into it more as the spring goes on. But as you're thinking about what you would include in those new grants, remember that's going to be building on to your program. That's going to be looking at how to continue it. But it's not always going to fund all of those things that were currently funded by your existing grant. So I would really encourage you, whether you're looking to apply for a new grant or not, think about where are your gaps if you get that funding, where are your gaps if you don't get that funding, so that you're prepared for either scenario. So our example on the screen is if we didn't have NAL funding, where would our gaps be? Now you'll see in regular font our wants, and to make it easy on the screen, I went ahead and included our needs on the same screen, lowered and in italics. So you'll see that I have $25,000 available in year one that I could use for teacher salaries, leaving me with a $32,000 gap. I don't have anything to help out with workbooks. I don't have anything to help out with language learning or professional conference, but I do still have that funding for local cultural activities. So I actually have an additional $15,000 here that I can use to provide programming for my students. It doesn't necessarily cover the expenses that I had originally included, but sometimes you'll find that. And then you have to decide, is that something that I want to move forward with or not? And then you'll see how it plays out as we go across the 3 years and we look at what are our projected expenses, our available funding, and that funding gap. And while those aren't always the most fun numbers to look at, it really gives us an idea of where we need to focus our efforts, what components really need the most help, and where we need to really look for some new funding streams. So it's much better to know now and be able to formulate a plan than to be surprised by unexpected expenses as you move along. So let's think about some potential funding resources. So once you know what you're trying to sustain, the associated expenses and where your funding gaps lie, that's when you can really get into the planning of how to fill those gaps. Sustained programs are typically going to have multiple sources of funding. Like I said, even if you're going to be reapplying for the large NAL funding, you're still going to need additional things most likely to fill some other gaps. So as we think about it, it can be really tempting to try to find one huge funding stream that's going to cover everything. And it's not that that's bad. If you can find that, great. But it's really challenging to find those large funding streams, and it can be dangerous if your program is relying solely on one single funding source. Because if anything happens to it, it puts your entire program in jeopardy and leaves you scrambling. So the more we can diversify your funding plan so that the loss of one funding stream is much more manageable, the better off you are. So let's look at some of our options here as we think about federal funding. There are block grants, there are discretionary grants, there are different options you can explore through the federal funding option. And then as we've kind of talked about last week on our quarterly grantee meeting, that they do anticipate that notice of proposed priorities being out soon for NAL, which then just puts us further down the path toward a new grant application coming out for that as well. Then also look into your state funding. Many states have some general funds that could be utilized for this type of program, as well as specific grants. So looking at what your state has available that might be applicable. And then look at local funding. Now that might be utilizing some of your organization or school district's general funds. Sometimes part of that can be allocated over. You might look at agency or partner funding. So who are those other organizations or partners that have similar goals and missions that you could work with? And then also looking at your tribal funding. There are many of you have been able to utilize some of that funding as well. And also think about, as you're thinking about those general funds, I know one thing that one of the grantees has been able to do is that they've taken such a large number of students into their program that it equals out to what would be a full-time teacher of that grade level anyway. So once the grant ends, they would be able to cover that teacher through just the general funds for the school district, because they would need that teacher anyway. So just thinking about some of those creative things, what can you do to make monies work? Then as we move over to the other side of the screen and think about private funding. So think about foundations, like Susan shared some of the foundations in her area that have been able to come alongside and partner for their project and will continue to do so after grant funding. Also, sometimes there are company-sponsored foundations, and those can be good because often if you have someone on your sustainability planning team that is either employed by that company or knows someone employed by that company, that can help kind of pave the way into that conversation or that particular funding source. And then many communities have foundations that you can tap into. And then, as we talked about before, in-kind can be some of your most invaluable monies. So whether that is looking at volunteers and how some of your staffing needs could be covered by the use of volunteers, or thinking about, again, those partners. And this is why, you know, we've really kind of stressed throughout the grant cycle, having good relationship with your partner, having MOUs in place with your partners so that you can have that already built up so that when your grant ends, you can continue that partnership and those services to students. And then finally, some other things that some programs do are look at ways to generate income and or charge fees. And while that might not be a good fit or ideal for everyone, it may be something that some want to look into. And then finally, fundraising. And this again is going to depend on your organization and your situation, but it may be a situation where you decide engaging in some fundraising events or having a fundraising committee might be useful for your program. So as we think about these particular funding resource categories, are there any that in particular you'd like to learn more about? While we have limited time today, we're going to use this feedback as we plan upcoming technical assistance and coaching and provide further information just out to grantees. So what you can do is, you don't have to type, but if you use that same annotate where you go up to the top, use the drop-down menu to annotate, but this time you'll see where it says draw or stamp, and you can use either one. I like to use stamp because it's easier, and you can pick an arrow, check, whatever you like, and then put your stamp or your mark on any of these funding resources that you would like to get more information about or you hope to find out more about. And you can put that right on the screen. If you're having any trouble annotating on the screen, also feel free to pop what it is that you're interested in over on the chat box, and we'll get to you. We'll get your info recorded that way. And I see someone asking, some organizations want to purchase our workbook. Are we allowed to sell at cost? So I can get you more specific information in regards to this, but in general, it would be up to your school district and their policies. But I do know who's asking, and I will make sure to get you more information. Any other particular funding resources that you'd like to learn more about or get more information on? And we'll be happy to make sure and get that out. Like I said, while we have limited time today, we're definitely going to continue talking about sustainability across the spring and summer. So this is a great time to indicate those areas that you think would be helpful to get more info on. And I do see one heart way down low. I'm not sure where you are quite headed, so I'm going to give you a second if you want to get a heart anywhere else. And that way, there we go. Perfect. And as well, if there are other categories of funding resources that you want to make sure that we cover at a future date or you get more information on later, again, put those in the chat box and we'll make sure to include them. We want to make sure we're getting the information most helpful to you. All right. I did go ahead and clear everything because, like I said, it will stay on the screen if we don't clear it before we move on. But like I said, we'll definitely take all of those under advisement and get you more info out on those areas. So as we think about funding, I want to put one caveat out there, and that is don't chase money. So this is a common thing that can happen with programs, particularly when you're working on sustaining a really large scale initiative. So just because a funding opportunity exists doesn't mean it's a good fit for your program or that you should apply for it. This is where that vision or mission comes back into play, as well as your goals and objectives of your program. It can be really tempting that if you find a good available funding source, that you just apply for it because it's got a good amount of money available and you have a good chance of possibly getting it. But what I want you to really think about with each potential funding source is, will this particular funding resource match your vision or mission? And is it going to help you meet your goals and objectives? If it doesn't meet those criteria, don't apply. The reason is you shouldn't be changing your vision, mission, goals, or objectives just to make yourself squeeze into a prospective funding resource. And this is often what people in the nonprofit world refer to as mission creep. Okay, and that's where you start finding a funding resource and it's asking you to do something outside of your vision and mission, but it's a good fund, and so you go for it. And so you kind of shimmy yourself over here to make it work. Well, then another one comes up and you go for that and you kind of shimmy yourself over here. And then soon you find that you're really not in alignment with your own mission and with your own goals and objectives anymore. So for example, let's say that you find a large STEM grant and it allows for salary and supply expenses, which are things that you need covered, but currently your program really does not address STEM, and this grant requires you to add a very heavy, strong STEM component to your program. That's when you really need to sit down with that sustainability team and think, is this a good fit? Does it make logical sense to add this huge STEM component into our language learning program? Okay? Or think about, sometimes it's just overstretching yourself. So you might have found a foundation that targets middle school youth and they have a great opportunity available, but currently your program only goes through grade 4. Your plan had been to add a grade level each year, so it was going to be a couple years out before you got to middle school, but it's kind of tempting to just scale up a couple grade levels in order to qualify for the funding faster. And that's where, again, going back to those goals and objectives, is this really in the best interest of your program and of your students? Or are you going to be scaling up too fast and not able to keep the quality of your program? This is also the place where your sustainability team can be really helpful, as they help you kind of go through all these potential funding resources and figure out which ones are actually good matches for your program. So there's my one word of warning of the day. All right. So now that you know where your funding gaps are, we really want to start thinking about what are your potential funding resources. So we talked about all those different categories of funding resources, but it can get a little overwhelming as you start going through all of them. So as your sustainability team is working on that, using a document like this, and all of these are going to be available both as standalone resources you can download out of the resource database, as well as in your project planner. But using a resource like this can help you really get organized. So you can start looking at it by category: federal, state, local, private, or in-kind. And then really detailing out, okay, we found this potential source. It could potentially fund up to this amount, but it has these restrictions. Here's the time frame for application. Here's the time frame for the funding. Any pertinent notes, maybe a link to the application or more information. And all of that can start going into this document, so that then you start getting a plan together for which ones are truly a fit, what timeline for when you need to start preparing information for possible applications, when do you need to start reaching out to certain partners. It just helps everything get organized. And it's also great because if you are truly using the power of that sustainability planning team, then they can all be inputting their information as they're working into this one document. And then when you meet as a full team, you can start breaking it down. Now, one thing just to remember is that as you're going through here, don't forget about in-kind partners and resources. Make sure to include those on this spreadsheet as well, because you really want to get them all in one place. And that includes, if you're planning on reapplying for the NAL grant, put that in here under federal, because that's one of your potential funding resources, and you want to make sure that you've got that in your timeline of things that you need to do for sustainability. Now, one other tip and idea as you are doing this is, we've talked about the NAL resource database. I know many of you have already checked it out. It has those various tabs for things like organizations, conferences, publications, technology, certifications, and programs. But after today's webinar, we will open the newest tab of the database, which is the funding tab. Now, I want to put the asterisk on that this is not every funding source available in regards to your native language program. What this is just some resources. I would encourage you that as you're looking at this, if you come across a great resource, share it with us. We'll add it to the database. The database is really just as strong as all of us putting information into it. So if you find a wonderful resource, whether it's a good fit for your program or not, feel free to just shoot me an email. You don't have to give me all the info. You can just give me a web link, the name of something. I'll do the follow-up for you. But we want to just be all adding to this great funding tab like we have been some of the others. So this is another one that we'll be adding to, of course, throughout the spring. But it's one place that you can start looking for those different resources. And then a reminder that the technical assistance resources, so things like the recording of this webinar, recordings of previous webinars, all of these spreadsheets that you've seen today will all be available there in the database as well. And then remember that the spreadsheets will also go in your planner. Now, we had a question pop up, Susan asking, will the database be available after the grant? And I will have to check as far as availability. At this point, it is invite only. My best guess is that it would continue to be available to you as a past review, but I will make sure and get you an exact answer on that and get back to all of you quickly. So TBD on that one, but that's just my best guess as of yet. Now, outside of that, one of the types of funding that we've talked about before are Title VI funds to support native language activities. Now, if you went to the project directors meeting, then you at least heard a little bit about this, or if you were on last week's quarterly grantee meeting, a little bit there. But all but one of you, so 4 of the 5 of you, did state in your proposal that you were going to utilize Title VI funds to help sustain your program beyond grant funding. And this was competitive preference priority 1. And you'll notice the exact wording was a project in which either the lead applicant or a partner receives or is eligible to receive a formula grant under Title VI of the ESEA and commits to use all or part of that formula grant to help sustain this project after conclusion of the grant period. So like I said, this is something applicable to most of you. The one grantee that did not do this competitive preference priority, that doesn't mean that you can't still reach out to your Title VI person in regards to this. So I would definitely look into this as well. So a little bit about Title VI. It's a formula grant program. Funded programs for this are to meet the unique cultural, language, and educational needs of American Indian and Alaska Native students to ensure that all students meet the challenging state academic standards. These funds have to be used to carry out a comprehensive program for Indian students, and they must supplement the regular school program. The objectives for these programs are to be based on a comprehensive local assessment, so a needs assessment. They have to be unique to the educational and culturally related academic needs of the Indian students to be served. They have to be student outcome based, and they have to be measurable. Also, the program activities and services have to be culturally relevant, and support and be directly related to the objective. So you can see, hopefully, how most of your programs do fit within the type of programs that could be covered under this. Now, as part of Title VI, it is required that they hold a public hearing. So this is an open consultation to provide a full opportunity to understand the program and to offer recommendations regarding the program with the following: parents of Indian children and teachers of Indian children, representatives of Indian tribes on Indian lands located within 50 miles of any school that the agency will serve if such tribes have any children in school, Indian organizations, and if appropriate, Indian students from secondary schools, including through public hearings held by such agency to provide to the individuals described in this. And this is to be at least an annual public hearing. And this is part of that needs assessment process. There also is to be an Indian parent committee, so the local education agency must develop the program with the participation and written approval of the Indian parent committee. Approval from the Indian parent committee is needed for the application to be submitted. This is the Title VI application. And then written approval from the Indian parent committee is collected on the Indian parent committee approval form. The written approval must be attained before Part 2 closes. So this is all part of your local education agency's application for Title VI funds. So you'll want to figure out who is your Title VI project director. It's often your director or executive director of grants, of federal programs, something along that line. But you'll want to figure out who this person is and meet with them. See if you can attend the Indian Education Parent Committee meetings. That's a great time both to see the feedback from that committee and then also to tell them more about your program. Attend that Indian Education public hearing. That's an important part of that needs assessment process for Title VI. And then know the application cycle, because if you want to use these funds to help sustain your program, then you need the parent committee to sign off on that. So it is quite the process. So you want to know what that application cycle looks like. What are those dates so that you can get those on your calendar and be part of it. That also gives you an opportunity to ask any questions. One of the things that often comes up is because it was in your grant and you got competitive preference because of that, what if now the parent committee and through the hearings and through the needs assessment process, it's determined that they are not able to help you sustain your program? That's not something that you're going to go back and be penalized for, but that's definitely something that you'll want to explore to the fullest extent possible. Now, if you have any questions about Title VI, you will want to turn to our Title VI expert. So many of you, particularly if you were familiar with Title VI or if you were at the project director meeting, you met Kim Smith. Kim has now gone over to the Bureau of Indian Education. And so Annabelle, who has worked right alongside Kim for the time previous, has now stepped up. And so she will be answering all of your Title VI questions. So you can reach out to her at annabelle.toledo@ed.gov. And remember, that'll also be in the recording in the slides. So if you have any questions about Title VI, Annabelle is more than happy to answer those for you. All right, so as we move away from Title VI, we focused a lot on the funding needed in order to sustain, but I also want to take a little bit of time to discuss the support that's needed to sustain your program. So often people hear support and they go straight to thinking about money, but you're going to need support from your school district or your organization and from within your community. So for discussion purposes, I'm going to unite those two into the term community, but know that I'm talking about both your school community and your larger community. You have to have that community support in order to sustain beyond your grant funding. Your community needs to know about your program. They need to believe in your program. And ideally, they need to be engaged in your program so that you can continue to secure the funding that you're going to need to keep going. So within that, I want to talk about two different types of program support. One being general community support and one being program champions. So with community support, a lot of that has to do with making sure that your community, again, both your school community and your at-large community, Know about your program. You don't want to be the best kept secret in town. You want to be everybody's favorite program, the newest, coolest thing going on, the program that everyone is talking about. That will help you build that community support that you're going to need to sustain. You want to make sure that your families know what you're doing. You want to make sure that they know that you want them to spread the word about your program. You want to make sure that everybody in the towns and communities that you serve know what's going on in your school, in your organization, in those language classrooms. Now, to get more specific, let's think about your program champions. These are specific individuals. Think back to when we talked about that sustainability team and we talked about people of influence. Those can make great program champions. It might be a particular parent that's very outspoken about the great benefits that their child has gotten from your program. It might be a particular elder in your community that has come in and volunteered and is passionate about what's happening with language learning in your program. It might be a teacher or another person from within the school who's really excited about what's happening in the school community with this. Don't limit yourself when you're looking for your program champions, but these are the people who are going to go out and they're going to spread the word. They're going to tell everyone about how wonderful your program is, and they're going to be willing to advocate on your behalf. And those are people that you want out there, not only building your program support, but on your sustainability team. And they're a great liaison between the two, between the community and that sustainability planning. So start thinking about those program champions. Who could you engage, or who are currently your program champions? Now, I've actually seen a lot of you doing some cool things to build community support and build program champions in some really neat ways. But I would love for you to share some of those. So I'm just going to stop share. As I said, we're a smaller group today, so I think chatting is a little bit easier. So if you want to unmute, what are some ways that you've been able to build community support?
This is Susan. So I was just thinking, we have our two languages, and our second language is one that I'm weaker on, so I rely on the language. Well, we've lost all of our fluent speakers, but we have some younger learners. And then we also have a linguist at the university who studied Benti, and she has been reviewing our workbook like crazy. And I ask all these questions because we don't have the conjugation to flesh out our workbook. And, and practically every week I'm contacting her and she's always there. And then I'm thinking about this week, we send snacks to our teachers. And I didn't ask the teachers to do it, but kids from all these classrooms, the teachers, they're just sending me emails, and the kids are speaking their language, asking for the crackers and say they're eating crackers. And I don't know, because they hadn't done that before. And so this is very timely to build our program support. And I was just holding on to them, but maybe I should share them now.
Yeah, I think you should definitely share them. Yeah, any of those things where you can share the excitement that the students have about their language learning is wonderful. And I know, so Susan had a winter program for their language program, and you could also see how excited in the community support she had, the elders coming in to the school district offices to be able to watch the students do their performances in language was so sweet to see. So yeah, I think the community loves to see that excitement about the learning.
Oh yeah, that was our virtual holiday, and I think this was our 13th year of it. And every year we expand, learn harder songs, so that's been a real plus. And then community members, elders especially, who are in what do they call it? Not residential, but an elders home. Yeah, they come over.
Yeah, and they were loving it. Well, and Charlene, do you want to share about the event that y'all had in November for the whole community?
In November, we sponsored a, I forget what the event was called, sorry, but we hosted, we invited other people from the community to do job fair within the community. The university people came out to share their just information about recruiting. And then with the local departments, like the police department, they advertise their side and then they just displayed it. And then and then from our department, we with the APS, we shared our program and we answered questions here and there with parents in the community that had questions. And then we also distributed t-shirts, and there were just a whole lot of people that kind of contributed to the program. And then we hosted, not hosted, but we provided a meal, a real good meal for the community. So we had a perfect outcome of just sharing with everybody took input and what they wanted to share. So within the community.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, I'm going to jump back into our PowerPoint because we have just a couple things to cover before we're out of time today. And one in particular I wanted to make sure we got to is the action planning. So we've talked about all those things. Who's going to help you with your sustainability planning on that team? What are you trying to sustain? How are you going to sustain it? So now we need to start putting together a really good plan. So on the screen, you'll see just one model of how you can go about creating a sustainability action plan. We've discussed and used SMART goals a lot throughout your program planning, and you can use that same skill here. Start by creating a SMART goal for each program activity or component or a particular piece of your sustainability plan, and use your planning data to determine your current achievement status. Next, work with your team to determine what strategy or strategies you'll implement in order to achieve that goal. And remember that you're often going to have multiple strategies helping to address that one goal, and that's fine. Once you've decided on those strategies, start breaking them down into their component action steps. What has to be completed in order to carry out that strategy? Detail the action steps, any necessary materials, the timeline for implementation and completion, and who's going to be responsible for each step. Having all that in your action plan also makes monitoring and keeping up with it much easier. So let's pop over and look at an example. So in the example, you'll see that by April 2020, the sustainability team will identify at least 3 potential funding sources as measured by their entry into the potential funding sources spreadsheet. So this particular SMART goal is all about researching those funding options. And so strategy, the current status is we haven't identified any funding sources beyond that we're going to reapply for the NAL grant. Okay, so our action steps, we're going to schedule a meeting with the district grant writer. They're often a great resource both for thinking about specific grants, but they may know of some that could be utilized for your program as well. We want to take along that sustainability planner that we've been working on, and we want to do that by March. And we have Janisa responsible for that, so there's a particular person on that. And then we're researching new funding streams. Now, notice that we have multiple people in charge of it, because that's a big task. So if you have a team, then you can break it down. Maybe Sam works in a school district. He's very familiar with school district funding, so he's going to handle looking at that. Janisa is more familiar with grants, so she's going to look into those. And then Harry's a community member who's really active in the community, and so he's going to look at foundations. So you've kind of broken it down so everybody has a role and no one's feeling overwhelmed. And you're going to get back together in April to look at those options. Maybe your next strategy is you're going to look at that feasibility of utilizing Title VI funds. So you're going to schedule a meeting with your Director of Federal Programs, And you're going to do that by February, and Bob's going to be responsible. But notice how this starts building you out a timeline of activities and exactly who's going to report back. So again, no one's feeling overwhelmed, but the plan is moving along. So this will be up in your planner. You can utilize it there, or if you want to download a blank one as a actual spreadsheet, you can do that from the resource database too. As you're putting together this action plan, there's also a little checklist you can utilize as far as looking at the structure of your plan. Think about, is it SMART? Have we based it on best practices? Is this one the entire team supports, like we talked about with some of the funding? Is this in alignment with our goals and objectives? Are any of these things dependent on other activities, programs, or people? That's important to know if it takes a waterfall. Is everything assigned to a specific person? Is everything feasible? And is it something that's going to lead to us accomplishing that SMART goal we set? So it's a great checklist to use once you started putting that plan together. Now, finally, as we close, if you have any questions, make sure to pop those over in the chat box, or I'll hang around at the end of the session and I'm happy to answer any questions or chat. But I did want to give you an opportunity to provide a couple of pieces of feedback before we leave. Is there anything in particular you'd like to learn more about with respect to sustainability? I'm going to let you put that over in the chat box because I know it takes a little less work than going on the screen. But think about, is there anything you'd like to learn more about or you'd like more information on in regards to sustainability? And again, just pop that right in the chat box. And while you're doing that, we'll have one of our final polls. So to what extent did today's webinar increase your knowledge of sustainability planning? Again, an anonymous vote. Did it significantly increase your knowledge, moderately increase your knowledge, minimally increase your knowledge, or not increase your knowledge? And if you can just click your answer on the screen, it'll record those right quick. I know you may be both writing in the chat box and clicking on the screen. Get everybody's answers locked in. All right. Appreciate you responding to that. And then the other poll is, would you like to continue working on sustainability? So we do have the availability this year to do some smaller group sessions. So is this something that you'd like to continue working on? So you can see, yes, I'd like to work on sustainability during coaching calls or the next onsite. Or you would like to maybe focus in on a specific part of sustainability in like a small group setting with other people who want to work on that particular thing. Possibly you'd like another large group webinar, or no, you feel like you're ready to accomplish sustainability. You have the tools and resources you need, and you're ready to get out there and sustain. I'll give you a minute to lock in your answers on this one. And this just helps us as we kind of plan out some of the other technical assistance things that we'll offer throughout the spring and summer. And remember, if there are specific areas that you'd love to explore more or learn more about, make sure to put those in the chat box, and I'll make sure that we get that information covered. All right, so we're right at time, so I want to give you just a couple of next steps. I would suggest going out and starting to assess the current state of your sustainability planning with your sustainability team. If you don't have your sustainability team together yet, start getting those individuals together. Start that work. Begin determining what you want to sustain and what you need to sustain in your current resources. We'll definitely follow up on sustainability during your February coaching calls. And remember that this webinar will be available. I'll send out the information tomorrow, but it'll be available on the resource database starting tomorrow for you to be able to share with any team members who weren't able to join us live. And remember that our next webinar is going to be on second language instructional strategies. And I know Charlene and Susan, this one might be of particular interest to y'all because you do work with the students directly. So I think you'll really enjoy this content. We are narrowing down the date, so I will get it to you just as soon as possible, but it will be either March 4th or 5th. So that'll be coming up. Now, this is our very last poll. The very last poll we will ask you to do is just, was this webinar a beneficial webinar for you and or your program? It's a quick yes or no. And then I'm going to unshare. So as we wrap up, if you have any further questions, I will stay on. I'm happy to continue answering those. Sarah Whitehead has popped our feedback survey over in the chat box. If you don't mind clicking on that, it's super short. We've really narrowed it down this year to make it a quick response for all of you. So if you don't mind filling that out before you head out into the rest of your Thursday, I would appreciate it. But otherwise, I'll be on if you have questions, or feel free to pop other areas into the chat box of things you'd like to discuss further in regards to sustainability. Thanks for taking the time to join us today, ladies, and for sharing all your information about your programs.